I'd like to welcome everyone on the call here today. We have a training plan for everyone that's eligible for AICP credits. So we think that it'll take about 2.5 hours, which I realize is quite long for a training, particularly over WebEx. So we welcome you to get up and grab a cup of coffee or whatever you need as we go through. We've got 3 presenters here today. My name's Sarah Bowen, and I'm a planner and the director of the Philadelphia Planning and Environmental Services Group. And then we also have, I have 2 colleagues on the phone that will be presenting as well. Mike, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure, Sarah. Yeah, so hello, everyone. I'm Mike Garner. I reside in our Denver office. I've been with the company about 18 years, and I lead up our hazard mitigation and resiliency unit here.
Great. And Brad?
Yeah, hi, my name is Bradley Dean. I'm in the Alexandria office. I work out of our coastal science and engineering group and primarily focus in coastal ecosystems, coastal science, and as a resilience specialist and communication specialist on our community engagement and risk communication contract with FEMA.
Great, thanks. And we're glad to have presenters here today that span both the planning practice and water practice, which I think is great because as we dive into this training, you'll see, or many of you, recognizing many of the names on the phone, already know how connected our practices are and in the work that we do here. So we've got purposes and objectives for our training. We're going to go through all 4 phases of emergency management planning. And I know a lot of us work in the hazard mitigation area, whether it be with floodplain management or on hazard mitigation plans across the company. But we're going to also dive into the other phases of emergency management planning as well. We're hoping to share ideas that you can incorporate into other plans that you're working on. Emergency management, mitigation are concepts that don't need to be in standalone plans. They're excellent things to be incorporated into transportation plans, into environmental plans, airport planning for sure. There's all sorts of value to some of these topics and other planning processes as well. And we're going to point you in the direction of tools and resources so that you can learn more as well. So we've got 4 phases to our training here today. We're going to dive into hazard mitigation planning, then emergency preparedness and response planning are connected, so we're going to cover them together. Then disaster recovery planning and disaster resilience is kind of an overarching concept that ties into hopefully all of our work at some point. So this is a good diagram that was in recent FEMA guidance that we helped deliver as part of the CERC National Project. And we're going to probably mention the CERC National Project a couple of times. For those that aren't involved in it, CERC stands for Community Engagement and Risk Communications. And that's our work for FEMA headquarters and then regions throughout the country in order to improve communications and outreach for FEMA, particularly in the field of mitigation, but touching on the other planning aspects as well. So this diagram shows you the different phases. Preparedness are actions that you would ideally take before a disaster so that you're ready, so that you have your medications with you if you need to evacuate, so that you know how to get out of the building that you work in. And then the disaster happens, and there's immediate short-term response. And response focuses on life safety and saving folks and getting them out of harm's way, and then making sure that the infrastructure in the buildings that we all live in are safe to return to that particular area. There's recovery that it happens right after disaster to long-term recovery. So right after disaster, you may be looking to recover some of your belongings from your home, but really getting back to a safe location can sometimes take weeks, months, years in order to rebuild and fully recover a community, particularly after a large disaster. Now, mitigation's at the bottom, and those of us that are mitigation planners like to do mitigation at all times, but it is something that is important to note happens both before and after disaster. So ideally, we elevate that house out of the way so that it doesn't have the impact of the flood. But we also know that attention and resources can be short. So sometimes the best time to get mitigation in place is after disaster, when there's federal funding flowing into an area to help them recover from the disaster. There's often a lot of hazard mitigation grant program funding to help people mitigate and recover from the disaster and be safer from the next one. But there's also attention, so people are focused. So instead of saying, oh, why do I want to elevate my house? That flood's never going to happen here. They're saying, oh, yeah, I see how bad it is, and I don't want that to happen to me again. So disaster recovery can be a fantastic time to implement mitigation. So we're going to touch on all 4 phases of emergency management planning. So these are the 4 phases and the items that we'll be referring to in the coming slides. Wanted to touch on some of the types of plans out there where you're going to see some of these topics. I mentioned hazard mitigation plans already, but there's business continuity plans that focus on how do we keep our operation running in the event of a disaster. How do we get access to our data if we don't have access to our building? And this is something that's important for all sorts of different businesses. Emergency operations plans, vulnerable population plans. How do we take care of the folks that don't necessarily understand the evacuation messages or don't have a car to evacuate from the city? How do we take care of everyone so that everyone's safe when we need to respond? So these are some of the types of plans that we'll touch on in the presentation, and we'll break them out into more details as we move forward. So I'm going to pass the baton to Mike, who's going to dive into hazard mitigation planning in more detail. I will say also that we have a chat at the sidebar, and you can ask questions at any time during this presentation, and we'll work to answer them. And then at the end of each section, we're going to open it up for questions as well.
All right, did you switch it over, Sarah?
It is passing the privileges to you. It looks like you have it.
Let me know if it doesn't look okay. So hello, everyone. Thanks for your time today. I'm going to focus specifically on hazard mitigation planning for this piece. And so we're just going to dive right in. I think this is probably the most important thing to understand is that hazard mitigation is a sustained action taken to reduce or eliminate long-term risk to people and property from natural and human disasters and hazards. And so the important thing here is we're not talking short-term fixes. So just keep that in mind as we're talking.
Mike, excuse me. Sorry, we're not seeing your screen. You need to share it.
Sorry about that. Let's see here. Share. All right, is that better?
Perfect.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Tracy. Okay, so here's the definition I just read, and again, it's just important that the intent of hazard mitigation is to break the damage repair cycle. And so just, again, keep that in mind as we're talking today. So how are we going to get where we are? So hazard mitigation planning is actually one of the only, I think the only plan across the country that is federally mandated. The Stafford Act required states to have HMPs, and that's an acronym we'll use throughout the call here. And then the Disaster Mitigation Act of 2000 amended that and required local governments and tribal entities to also have an HMP in order to receive pre- and post-disaster funding. And being in the FEMA world, there's a lot of alphabet soup relating this, but just to give everyone a little understanding, there's basically 3 different funding programs that are tied to hazard mitigation plans. The first is HMGP, which is Hazard Mitigation Grant Program. These are monies that are made available after a presidential disaster declaration. The second kind of pot of money is termed the Pre-Disaster Mitigation Program, and this assists with planning, technical assistance, et cetera. And then the third program that FEMA has is called the Flood Mitigation Assistance Program, or FMA. And so those are kind of the 3 pots of money that are available to communities that do have an approved hazard mitigation plan. So just to take a step back before we kind of dive into the details, here's just some graphics showing disaster losses since 1980. And you can see in the upper right there that there's really no part of the country that avoids any or all of them. It is a big deal, and I think everyone's noticed in recent years disasters seem to be in the news a lot more than they used to be. And here's a figure that I really like. This was from last year, and this summarizes the billion-dollar hazard events that occurred across the U.S. I was just actually looking before this call, and in 2018, since July 8th, we've actually already had another $6 billion events, and there are 2 that they're basically still tallying the money up, and they could also be billion-dollar events. So we could spend the whole call just talking about this, but I mean, the fact is they are occurring more frequently and impacting a large portion, of our country. So this is an important subject to talk about. When we talk about hazard mitigation plans, from FEMA's perspective, communities are only required to focus on natural hazards. And you can see a laundry list of them in front of you. Some other ones that come up depending on what region of the country you're in include extreme temperatures, flash flooding, ice jams, invasive species, biological or pandemic, animal disease, radon exposure, space weather is always a fun one to read about, summer storms and lightnings, or wind storms and winter storms. So I think everyone's familiar with the hazards that impact, where you live at, but there is a large list there. And then we also get into looking into human-caused hazards. These are not required by FEMA, but a lot of communities and states like to include these in their hazard mitigation plans. It also oftentimes helps them align the hazard mitigation plan with other emergency or community planning efforts that are underway. And so you can see, again, the laundry list in front of you. Other ones sometimes included in plans include transportation accidents, utility interruptions, or urban fire. And so now we're going to get into talking about developing a hazard mitigation plan. And what you see up in front of you is a screenshot of a guidance document that FEMA put together in 2013. For those of you interested in this subject or wanting to learn more, that's probably the best resource to go to. You can find that very easily on FEMA's website. But that basically gives locals kind of a step-by-step handbook for how they can implement and develop a hazard mitigation plan. So what you see now is what's referred to as the plan review tool. And what this is I think it's about 4 or 5 pages of these types of check boxes, which every plan has to meet to get FEMA approval. For everyone's background, these mitigation plans have a life of 5 years. And so once FEMA approves them, that starts the clock ticking until the next update is required. After the 5 years, if a community does not update their plan and get it approved, then they are no longer eligible for the funding we discussed previously. And I guess to give everyone some background, high-level background, basically there's kind of 5 pieces to this checklist. One relates to the planning process itself, and FEMA really wants to make sure that this was an all-inclusive effort that the public was involved. The second kind of stovepipe here is the actual hazard identification and risk assessment. This is where we start looking at historical hazards, the impacts they had, community vulnerability, and since this is a FEMA thing, you also have to focus in on the NFIP, the National Flood Insurance Program side of things, and if there are repetitive loss structures in a community. The third kind of element relates to the mitigation strategy, which is probably the most important part of these plans, is really, what your community's goals are and what your actions or mitigation projects are to accomplish those goals. How have you prioritized things, and probably most importantly, how the hazard mitigation plan is integrated into other community planning processes, which we'll talk a little bit more about later. And then I guess a fourth kind of silo is specifically FEMA wants communities to look at future conditions is what they term it. And what that could involve is changes in development in your community or the effects of climate change on, the weather events, and also changes in community priorities, over the last 5 years. And then the fifth one is just the formal plan adoption process. So I think it's important to note that these hazard mitigation plans have to be formally adopted by each community. And so that really does give an opportunity to, have these plans really have some traction and weight. And I guess that's the main intent here. So what's the planner's role in hazard mitigation? Well, obviously the first one is to develop a plan that will receive FEMA approval. So the community is eligible for those funding that we talked about, and also just so they're prepared, for themselves. Integrating this plan into other plans, policies, documents, and processes is the most important thing to figure out as part of the process. And also identifying a maintenance and evaluation procedure. So we don't want these plans sitting on the shelf and gathering dust. So FEMA does require these communities to say, we're going to meet annually or every 6 months to review this plan to make sure it's up to date. FEMA does consider these plans living documents, and so communities are encouraged to, update and edit these over the course of the 5-year life cycle of the plan. And so now we're going to kind of step through the various phases of a hazard mitigation plan, and we start with the most important, which is stakeholder and public involvement. At the beginning of all of these projects, the biggest challenge is identifying, a local steering committee or planning team to help champion this planning process through its course. And I think the important thing here is we really try and stress to communities that this isn't just an emergency management plan. This is a community plan. And with that said, you really need to have all your departments and agencies and nonprofits and community groups involved from the get-go. So a lot of efforts are taken in this step and throughout the course of the project to make sure that we do have an all-inclusive planning team. And this is just detailing that, FEMA requires documentation of this public involvement. FEMA doesn't mandate that you have X number of meetings. They just want to see that you are utilizing, the tools and vehicles that community uses to communicate as part of this plan. So sometimes it is meetings in person. Sometimes it's a road show around the community or the county or the state. Oftentimes now we're getting into the social media, websites, what have you. But really the important thing is just to make sure you're reaching out to the public in a manner that they are familiar with and, appreciate. I've worked on some more rural plans where honestly the best way to communicate with the public was to put a posting in the post office. So it just depends on your community, and it's important to customize each plan to that community. Step 2 is really kind of the data intensive side of these plans, the hazard identification and risk assessment. This is where a community takes a step back and just assesses all the hazards that can impact them. Obviously, one way to do that is to look back at historical events. The other sources available, online sources, news media, existing plans, both at the state and local level. Oftentimes, the HIRA is what we call it, utilizes GIS for those hazards that actually have some type of spatial footprint to them, and that really helps you kind of dive into not looking at the county or community as a whole, but zooming into neighborhoods that are specifically impacted by some of these hazards. We also have a lot of resources from FEMA's side to help with this risk assessment. We have the flood insurance maps that I think everyone is familiar with. Also, FEMA has a software package that it's been developing for a long time now. It actually sits on top of ArcGIS, and it's called HAZUS, Hazards US. And basically that allows for some really refined damage and loss estimations for the hazards of flood and hurricane and earthquake. So oftentimes HAZUS is used as part of these plans. And then after kind of all the data is digested and presented clearly back to the planning committee and the public, we get into the vulnerability assessment, which is linking the hazards to the community themselves. So what hazards or infrastructure are potentially at threat by certain hazards? How do you want to prioritize those for potential mitigation implementation? And I guess something that's rather new to FEMA, and they started mandating states to do this, I believe it was last year, and I'm sure communities will be required in the near future, but taking into account climate change and future conditions. FEMA's really stressing that. I think that's great to hear, but just be aware that, yeah, that is growing and getting a lot more attention from FEMA as we do these plans, and that can be a tricky conversation depending on the states and communities you're working with. But it's just, yeah, it's good to note for everyone that that is something that is being fit into these plans and analyzed. Here's a picture, just some maps from some past projects. Oftentimes, mapping those hazards that do have that footprint or spatial extent helps to better educate the community and the public. So oftentimes, too, making use of web maps is a good way to let the community, really zoom into this robust data that we've presented to them and compiled for them, and see exactly, how hazard X, Y, and Z is specifically impacting their house, their neighborhood, their community, their critical infrastructure. So I think that's one of the important parts of the vulnerability assessment, is not so much conducting it, but is presenting it in a clear way to actually let that impact the results of this planning process. And this example is from Delaware County, just showing kind of, again, some of the numbers and data that comes out of this process. So in this case, we're talking how many parcels are in the flood zone, what their value is, how many critical facilities are in there. All this information is what we produce as part of this planning process. And again, it's just the trickiest part is presenting it in a way that's digestible and usable, to the client, to the community in the end. Step 4 gets into a capability assessment. And really what this is looking at is, what does the community have to help implement hazard mitigation? So what current plans and policies and regulations do they have? What kind of funding do they have? What kind of staffing do they have to accomplish this? Oftentimes the capability assessment can lead to very implementable and useful mitigation actions and projects. So maybe a community is really in need of a grants manager to help apply for these monies. A lot of different things come up, but this is an important part. Once you identify the hazards and the vulnerabilities, the next step is to see actually what those true capabilities are. And this is an honest look at what the community has. There's no FEMA requirement saying you must have X, Y, and Z. It's just a chance to kind of reflect at what your community has available to them. And then step 5 is kind of the culmination of the planning process, and this is development of the mitigation strategy. FEMA mandates that you develop goals and actions. So basically goals are the high level, what the community would like to accomplish, and then your actions are kind of the boots on the ground. We're going to do X, Y, Z. This is a very important part of the planning process to get your community involved with, because after all, they live there, they've experienced past hazards, they know what culverts back up, they know what streets flood. So it's just important to get the community involved when we're talking about the mitigation strategy. And this graphic here is something actually I put together for a plan a couple months ago, but this kind of gives you a big picture snapshot of what that mitigation strategy really encompasses and what all the inputs should be. And so you obviously have the risk and vulnerability assessment results, but you also need to look at existing plans that communities have, maybe other projects that are identified in, say, a capital improvement plan or some other community documents. FEMA obviously has a wealth of information to contribute to this. For those of you that are interested, actually, they have a really good guidance document that highlights what these mitigation actions and projects actually look like and what they are. And so that's a great resource I find when I go into communities and we start talking about this. Oftentimes we do make use of public surveys throughout the planning process, and so that is oftentimes a very key input into this mitigation strategy. And then, as I mentioned before, the community capabilities is another input that needs to be evaluated as the strategy is developed. And so the next couple slides, I was going to just quickly walk through what these mitigation actions can be, what they are, because sometimes it's kind of hard to put your head around, what these are. And so basically, there's 4 categories of mitigation actions. The first being local planning and regulations. The second one is more focused on structure and infrastructure projects. The third type of mitigation action we have relates to natural systems protection. And then the fourth, which seems to always be a pretty important and heavy one for communities, is education and awareness, just making your communities aware of, what hazards can potentially impact them and what they can do about it. And so local plans and regulations, and we'll actually talk about these at the back end of this presentation, but this can relate to zoning regs, local plans, building codes, stormwater and floodplain regulations. Structure and infrastructure are kind of the hardscape things. So this could be elevating flood-prone structures, flood-proofing, maybe relocation or acquisition projects to get structures out of harm's way. Or flood walls, retaining walls, culverts, dams, levees, safe rooms. It just depends on the hazard you're trying to mitigate. Natural systems protection is the third, I think, and it's good to see this is getting a lot more attention from FEMA and from the locals, and this involves just trying to minimize or eliminate risk in, hazard-prone areas. Floodplain is a very easy example to talk about, getting structures out of the floodplain, but this can also get into stream restoration, forest management practices, conservation easements are a great one, wetland restoration and preservation is just another example. And then back to education and awareness, this is a huge one. What I've found working with communities is, a lot of people, especially when you have an area that's experiencing a lot of population growth, you have a lot of new people to that area, to that region that may not be aware of the hazards that exist in that area. So this is just a big one, and it also gets into maybe looking at targeting different demographics or groups. We find, reaching out to local schools is always a great one because the parents tend to learn from their kids. But, the sky's the limit in regards to this. And then on to step 6, which is the plan maintenance. And so I said FEMA does require that communities specifically state in these plans, how they're going to maintain their plan going forward over the next 5 years. How is it going to be linked to other plans? How is the community going to continue to involve the public in this? It shouldn't be a conversation every 5 years. It should be a regular thing. And FEMA also requires a very specific schedule for when, the planning team is going to meet, when the public will be brought into the mix, et cetera. So this one, it takes a lot of coordination with the planning team and the public to get this right, specific to each community. And then the final step is the approval and adoption. And so the way these plans work, once a community is done with the planning process, they actually submit it to their state for an initial review. And once the state looks through all the check boxes and feels they've been met, they pass it along to the FEMA regions, who conduct their own separate review. And once FEMA and sometimes there is some back and forth. I've had plans that have gone through without any state or FEMA comments, and I've had some that have had multiple iterations of needing to refine stuff to meet all the check boxes. But in the end, when FEMA is happy with your plan, they provide what's termed approval pending adoption. And what that says is, okay, FEMA approves this as soon as the community is adopted, and then it puts the onus onto the communities to formally adopt, and that starts kind of the 5-year clock again. And so now we're going to talk about, again, I think one of the more important parts about this is how to integrate hazard mitigation into other community plans and processes. In the past, these plans have been kind of relegated to the emergency management side of the house or the police side of the house. And in years past, unfortunately so, these were often done in a bit of a silo, oftentimes without actually the community planners being involved, if you can believe that. But, times are changing, and FEMA is really stressing this. And so I personally have noticed great improvements in getting the whole community to be a part of these plans and to integrate them into, other planning processes. One, challenge, and again, I kind of talked about this, but oftentimes planners themselves don't consider these as community plans. They figure they are some kind of emergency management plan that the local sheriff or the fire protection district is going to handle, and they don't need to be a part of it. Again, I think this is changing, but this is a challenge that we face on every project. And I guess another challenge is that oftentimes people are focused on infrastructure protection and emergency services projects, and they're not looking at the other, available tools, maybe at the policy level or land use, that could have actually a larger impact on mitigating hazards. So the benefits, and they should be pretty clear to everyone, but integrating and implementing a hazard mitigation plan helps to reduce a community's risk. Ideally, it would help to guide development and redevelopment patterns. And again, the whole point of this is to avoid or minimize risk. So whatever means you can accomplish that, that's the end goal. And so now we're just going to run through a couple, tools that a hazard mitigation plan can potentially be integrated with. And being, I assume, a majority of planners on the call here, these should be fairly familiar to you. And the first one we'll touch on is your comprehensive or master plans. I am seeing an uptick, at least out here, kind of in the Colorado area, of communities wanting to integrate these hazard mitigation plans into their comp plans. There are states such as California that actually already require this. But I think that's the trend we're seeing, is that these hazard mitigation plans are no longer sitting on a shelf by themselves, but they're actually being integrated into these community, master plans. Another opportunity to integrate is through zoning. This could include, hazard overlay zones, limiting development in your high hazard areas, maybe restricting uses in certain high hazard areas, or your standalone, floodplain ordinances, et cetera, specific to the hazards facing that community. Regulations are kind of another tool for communities to utilize, and these could involve enacting higher, standards for floodplains, maybe prohibiting development in the floodplain in general, or requiring elevation of structures, anchoring for those, in hurricane or high wind risk areas. Site planning and permitting is another useful tool. This is just a vehicle for a community to try and encourage development in the right areas and discourage or limit it in areas of known hazards. This is probably one of the more important ones, though I know, politics get involved and it's sometimes hard to implement, but this is a very important tool to consider as you're talking to these communities. And then building codes, which I'm sure everyone was thinking about. Once you have a structure, it needs to be able to survive whatever that hazard event is. And so just being up to, the current codes is something that can be accomplished, as part of this planning process. And another one I kind of mentioned previously, but integrating these into actually the budgetary process of a community, so into the capital improvement and transportation improvement plans, really devoting time, once you come up with this hazard mitigation plan and this list of actions and projects, make sure that those get evaluated every time you're looking through your CIP process, for opportunities to maybe piggyback off of other existing projects, or funding mechanisms that are available. So this is a big one. And then you have your functional plans, and there's, a million different flavors of these, but relating maybe a transportation plan, keeping evacuation routes in mind as you're going through that process. Maybe it relates to an economic development plan, and where a community is trying to guide investments to areas that are actually safe from these hazards or more resilient. Open space plans are a great tool to implement hazard mitigation, just targeting these high hazard areas for acquisition, turning them into greenways, parks, what have you. And then there's a million other ones, but, design guidelines could be implemented. Incentives is a big one to try and minimize a community's risk. And then there, again, are the design standards. Out here in the West, wildfires are a big deal. So, keeping homes out of the WUI is something needs looked at. And then there's an array of special programs, too, to consider. Transfer of development rights is something that I've encountered a lot more recently, and the intent there is to not take away people's property rights, but to basically have a vehicle to reward them for moving development into the lower risk areas. Other communities have used tax incentives to drive mitigation, even at the home level, maybe giving tax incentives for wildfire mitigation or flood mitigation, et cetera. And this screenshot here shows another FEMA guidance document detailing methods and approaches to integrating the hazard mitigation plan into other local planning efforts. So this also is a really good resource for those of you that are maybe more community, planners and haven't delved into the hazard side of things. I think this is a pretty useful guide for everyone. And so integrating, I guess, how do you do it? As part of these planning processes, one of the things is to really dig in to the local hazard mitigation plan, to make it clear that people understand what the risks are and what the community has identified as their mitigation strategies, what plans, policies, and tools are already in place that can potentially be leveraged. There's no need to start from square one here. There's a lot of ongoing efforts in these communities to build safer, and you just sometimes need to really dive into things to see what's there. And kind of similar to the capabilities assessment is, as part of this process, identifying the gaps or the holes. What is missing in this community to help us be safer, to keep our infrastructure and critical facilities out of harm's way, or to make sure they're built so that they can survive those types of events. And the next two slides here are just, you may not be able to read them very clearly, but just a couple different ways to look at how hazard mitigation can be implemented across other ongoing community endeavors. So this chart here shows the various hazards and mitigation kind of objectives on the left side there, and how they can really be implemented in a general plan versus zoning or development regs versus a CIP. And a similar kind of a different view to this, and this is actually borrowed from the state of Colorado, but they put together a planning for hazards document and website, which I'd encourage everyone to go check out. It's a really good tool. But what we're looking at here is they break things down by hazard and how you may be able to address each hazard in plans and policies or through incentives, sensitive area protection, development, building infrastructure, you name it. And actually the one cool thing about this website and tool that Colorado put together is it actually has case studies of all of these tools and how they have been successfully implemented across Colorado. So they also provide model, code language and content to make it easy for communities to implement these. So again, it's called Planning for Hazards, and it's a great resource that I think would be useful to any state across this country here. And with that said, I got through part one. I apologize if I was too fast, but I do welcome now any questions, comments, etc. So I think Tracy's going to open up the phone line to everyone. Please remind yourselves and everyone to put your phone on mute unless you're speaking, please. And so with that said, Tracy, can you open it up?
Okay, we should be able to hear you now if you have any questions.
Hey, Mike, this is Dave Freeborn in Region 6 in Denton. You had mentioned that slide from Colorado. Can you tell us the link for that, please?
Yeah, if you just honestly Google planning for hazards, and maybe add Colorado in there, that'll take you to it. But I'll pull it up here to confirm. I think it's just planningforhazards.com. And that's something that the state rolled out, I think it was maybe a year or two ago, in response to the flooding and wildfires that we had out here back in 2012, 2013. So luckily for us, we have a pretty proactive government and governor at this time that's really stressing this. So yeah, I encourage you to check it out, Dave. Anybody else have any questions?
Todd Williams, do you want to ask the question that you typed into the chat?
Yeah, Mike, Todd Williams here from Phoenix. Just wanted to ask, you had mentioned you have to get approval through FEMA. Is there any national master list of communities that can be looked at so we know what other communities to potentially target?
Yeah, so that's a good question from a business development standpoint. And so the short answer is kind of. And so FEMA does have some web mapping up that shows the status of plans. It oftentimes takes a little bit of digging to find out, who's expiring and when, but I can share with you, and this is actually kind of makes the business development side of things a little easier when you're trying to target communities, is that I would say probably 95% of these plans are entirely grant funded. And because of that, what FEMA does is through in two specific programs, so the FMA one that I mentioned before and the PDM, the pre-disaster mitigation, FEMA actually posts a list of all grant recipients. And so you can go to FEMA site and see who's getting money to do these plans. Generally, that list is published. I think last year it was published in March, and the RFPs will start hitting the street basically this month in August. So you do have a lot of lead time, and I'm happy to provide more background if anyone would want on that. Does that help, Todd?
Lisa Craig, are you able to ask your question, or would you like me to?
Yeah, that did, Mike. Sorry, it took a while to hit mute.
Oh, no worries.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. One of the things I found is that not every community has their hazard mitigation plan on their website, and that's really odd because it's such an important document for the community to understand. So is there a reason that some communities, and I'll speak from my own experience in Annapolis, they never have their hazard mitigation plan on the website?
Yeah, no, Lisa, it's a great point. I've actually seen some of these documents in past iterations have a for official use stamp on them. I have no idea why a community would not want to make this publicly available. The only thing that I've experienced is when we do dive into the risk and vulnerability assessment and we start looking at critical facilities, sometimes there are concerns about relaying information. I understand that, and what we have done in the past sometimes is push that information into a separate annex.
Right.
For government, but yeah, I don't know honestly why a community would not want to make that public. That's the whole.
Yeah, I feel like states should require it be there and available to the public. It's such an important document. So I agree with you that in repetitive loss properties, it's not like they're publishing the repetitive loss properties, but I understand about critical facilities and why they wouldn't want those specifically indicated. But it's really useless to go to the public and say, which is what I do, read your hazard mitigation plan so you understand what your risk is in the community, and they can't find it.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of a state-by-state thing, too. I know some states have them all, nice and clean on a single website, and some you have to dig for minutes to find it. But, yeah, that's a good point.
Mike, do you see the question I assigned you from Peter Quintanilla?
Yeah, I actually just saw it. Hey, Peter, let me just read that real quick. So after Hurricane Katrina, when visiting the different coastal communities in Louisiana and Mississippi, we realized that most towns' urbanism was not conducive to central space for gathering. Is there a push for looking at public spaces that can serve in this role? That's a good comment. I haven't personally had this come up much working in the region I am. I'm curious if anyone on the phone or Sarah has run into this.
A little bit in New Jersey, where particularly our coast is so developed in New Jersey, as they've looked at repetitive lost properties and buying them out, then they've turned that space into public space, or where they've started to have a park and they have only so many properties they may be able to buy out in a period of time. They've selected the properties that are park adjacent so they can expand on public space. But I haven't heard of that in Pennsylvania, where space isn't as much a premium.
Thanks, Sarah. And Peter, is there anything you want to add to that or follow up on? All right. Are there any others, Tracy? I'm not seeing any myself.
Nope, I don't see any more.
Hello?
Yes.
Oh, hi, this is Peter. Sorry, I think I was on mute, so that's why I had to type up the question. Yeah, and it's just in reference back to my question, and it's also about strategically placing a lot of those spaces rather than the leftover spaces, so that if in case there's an issue, then, the residents are able to go and congregate in one specific place. And during Hurricane Katrina, what we realized is that the Walmart parking lot ended up being those type of spaces that people would just gather, and then the National Guard will come in and distribute water or food from there. But most of the time they weren't centrally located, or they weren't, obviously because Walmart goes for the cheapest land. So I'm wondering if that is something that, should be probably looked at in a way to think about how, those spaces could be part of the resiliency or part of the preparedness for in case of natural events.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and that's definitely something I'll keep in my head going forward as I work with communities. And I guess, Peter, you also kind of reminded me something just to make everyone aware of, is that in addition to communities, other entities can actually develop hazard mitigation plans that FEMA approves. So some examples would be school districts, utility districts, fire protection districts. They are all eligible to be a standalone plan and directly apply for these grant monies. So if you have any clients that are in some of those little niches, just keep that in mind.
Yeah. And some of those gathering spaces are identified in preparedness and response plans. So when you're looking at evacuation plans, we'll have meeting places, we'll have comfort stations where folks can get a snack while they wait for a bus to evacuate. There'll be true shelters where folks can be fed and stay the evening and that type of thing. So I'd say some of those gathering spaces get identified more in the next phase of plans we'll be talking about.
Yeah, and then I guess that's my last point, Sarah, before I turn it over to you. I think that's important, and it's a very gray area to try and draw a box around hazard mitigation versus response and recovery, et cetera. And it's something that is a challenge through all these planning processes. And so, yeah, just if everyone can try and keep hazard mitigation separate from the others as Sarah starts to talk about them, I think that's important to keep clear.
Great.
But with that said, yeah, thanks to everyone's time. I'll hand it over to Sarah.
Great. And we're going to stay off mute for another couple minutes because the first step in our preparedness and emergency planning phase is a mini exercise. And I've done this in person, but not over the phone before. So let's give it a try. You're sitting in your office. There's a river adjacent to you. You are to the east of the river and need to evacuate eastwardly. So the towns come in and there's a hazmat spill on the river and it's not safe to cross it right now. So they're getting folks to evacuate north, and some folks are asking to shelter in place where they are until they can evacuate safely. But the edict is you cannot cross the river. Now, wherever you are, I know some of you are in California while I'm in Philly, your home and some other things that you may be interested in, like daycare or your child's school, are on the west side of the river. So what are some of the things that you're thinking about now that you have to evacuate at, lunchtime or mid-afternoon?
Hey, Sarah, this is Mike. I'd say traffic definitely would be something to keep in mind, right?
Traffic, yeah.
Is there anybody communication?
Yeah, who are you trying to reach?
Right. So people who are on the west side who might be able to pick up daycare for me, that kind of thing, making sure that there's a contingency plan if I can't cross the river.
That makes sense.
Yeah, this is Lisa. I was going to say the same thing, that maybe my first thought's going to be about there's a plan in place at the daycare facility, and I'm going to, anticipate that they're going to actually implement that plan relative to parent pickup, and that I already know what the location is for parent pickup. So, that's something I would hope is already in place.
Yeah. Yeah, those are exactly the things that most folks are thinking of. And I think we can put most folks on mute now, Tracy. If people have other ideas, just put them in the chat, please. Okay. So, yeah, the things to think about are, can you reach your family? Sometimes in this type of event, the cell phone coverage and area is overtaxed, so it's harder to reach people. A tip for that can be to have a common person to call that's outside of your neighborhood. So say maybe you have an aunt that's a couple counties away. You and your partner may be able to reach them more quickly than you're able to reach each other if you both work downtown in the middle of the city based on the way the cell phone coverage is. Do you know what the plans are at your children's school or daycare? Do you have alternative pickup people identified that may be able to reach them? You never know exactly what's going to happen, if it's going to be a river that becomes a barrier because of a hazmat spill, if it's going to become something else. And so having, a variety of folks in there that may be able to access and be able to pick folks up is helpful. Do you have any pets at home? How long is this disaster going to happen? How is it going to impact them? Do you have medicine that you typically take as soon as you get home at 6 o'clock? Do you have any of that with you so that if you had this type of crisis, you're able to access it, that type of thing? So answering these questions and planning for these types of questions are all related to what we call preparedness planning. And preparedness planning starts with yourself. So in a large disaster, you have to plan for your own safety. You have to make sure that you're able to evacuate safely, shelter in place safely, because if you're ill or impacted severely by a location, then obviously you can help others. And then that circle expands to your family and friends. I would not be particularly effective in responding to a disaster or doing much of anything unless I knew that my daughter was safe. So being able to plan for your family and friends and have backup plans in place for them as well. And then your business and organization. Immediately during the disaster, I think, we can leave our work for an afternoon, no problem. But as we get into longer term disasters or situations, how does that impact us? Can we access the server even though we can't access the building? Can we make sure that that deliverable gets out to the client, and some of the other things that keep our business going? Our community, our region, our nation, and ultimately our world. So preparedness planning, whether it's, for yourself, because disasters can impact all of us, or if you're planning for a community, you're thinking through these processes. So let's take a transit agency. Transit agency, you may want to be your key partner in evacuating Washington, D.C. What's a better way to get a lot of folks out of the city in a crisis than the nation's transit system in that area? But you have to think about how the disaster is impacting the folks that make the transit system operate? You know, how are they impacted? How are their family and friends impacted? Have you met with the bus drivers in advance and ensured that they have a plan in place for their families so that they're not worried about their families during a disaster and are able to drive the bus to get more folks out of the city? How about the organization? You know, if that transit agency relies on data and timing from a central facility, what if that's impacted by the disaster? Is there a backup system to get information out, to route buses and timing, and to answer calls from folks that are, you know, have their evacuation routes blocked for some reason? So this idea from, you know, self up to through community to the world is an idea that plays into all sorts of preparedness planning, where you're doing family plans for yourself, or if you're doing larger plans for agencies or communities, or an evacuation plan for a whole city. When we think about family preparedness planning, it's pretty simple, and it is a plan for the planners on the call here today. You want to have some sort of kit with the key materials that you would need to be comfortable during the disaster. You want to have a plan. You want to know that, hey, you know, I work downtown in the center of the city. My partner is going to have more flexibility to pick up our child, and if we can't return home for some reason, we're going to head towards, you know, my parents' or our friend's house in the suburbs. And then how you're going to stay informed and stay in touch with each other during the disaster and get updates from the authorities about what you should be doing. So planning fits into a crisis in a variety of different ways. There's planning that focuses on preparedness, which is what we were just talking about, but also can span into other elements of preparedness. So if we continue on with the transit agency, you know, do they have more buses that are available for disaster events? Do they have a memorandum of understanding with the school district that they would be able to partner on buses or share riders or that type of thing? Do they have a policy about fares during a disaster? A lot of these things can be fairly simple paperwork, but you don't want to be deciding during the disaster that we're going to waive fares, or you don't want to be deciding during the disaster that, you know, you can or you cannot share school buses with the school district. You want to decide that in advance and be prepared. Prevention can come into the planning here, and this is something that in some cases you can prevent certain types of accidents. This would be something that a lot of our hazardous materials companies would be aiming for prevention. They have policies in place to prevent spills, to prevent gas releases, to prevent different things from happening in the first place so that they don't become a disaster. And then response, this is the type of planning where, you know, the disaster's actually happened, and what are we going to do about it? In this particular phase, planners share a lot of information on information and GIS analysis. Some of the work that we've done for FEMA over the years has been helping to map and make disaster maps and damage assessment information for folks after disaster. There's a ton of information about what's going on, where things are critical, what type of issues, say, hospitals are having, and planners can be particularly good at gathering that information and sharing it. Okay, and if folks look at the chat, Lauren has shared a really great guide for having a FEMA family communications plan. And there's a lot of resources out there that folks that want to plan for themselves can look at in order to do this type of planning. Okay. So planning for preparedness is something that we can do in our own buildings. We can plan for our office, how we're going to evacuate. Many of our offices have those plans in place already, or drills in place already with fire drills. Some of those plans can be dusted off. I think if we browse on Compass, we'll see some newer versions and older versions of these types of plans online for our offices. So that's a step that you can take to make sure that you're safe, to make sure that you have a gathering space to evacuate to outside of your building. Preparedness plans can be for your community, can be for neighboring communities as well. Really getting together and looking at the type of risks that are in your area, and you can look to the hazard mitigation plan for that, and what type of actions you want to take in order to address them. Some of the components of it, and these type of components are kind of mimicked throughout a lot of the emergency management planning processes, is looking at the vulnerability, identifying the type of hazards that are going on, how you could be impacted by them, and how you'd like to resolve it. And then meeting and gathering information and figuring out how you want to respond to this, and then communicating it with folks, whether it be your family, your community, your business, in order to say, this is how we're going to respond to this particular thing. Something that can be done as part of this planning process is having an emergency management team. Some of you may already have that in your office. Somebody that makes sure or takes the kind of attendance list for the day with them to make sure that we've all evacuated safely, or informs folks that are new to our company about what our emergency plans are or where we evacuate to when there is a fire drill. Having these plans, having prevention. A lot of our offices have first aid and CPR training. That's an aspect of preparedness as well, to be prepared to respond to the most common type of disasters or health incidents that can impact us. And then sharing this information with your family as well. One of the key elements of preparedness is exercising. And so, you know, ideally, we don't want to test everything for the first time during a disaster. And it's nice to be able to sit down at a table and walk through a potential scenario and say, hey, this pretend event impacted us. You know, we've thought of everything except for, you know, the impact on our servers. You know, maybe we need more of a backup plan for our IT, or you can find communication glitches that you didn't realize were there by having an exercise in advance. The drills that we participate in for fire drills in pretty much all of our buildings, I imagine, are a step of this process. It's a type of an exercise to test what we're doing, and then to make sure that there's a feedback loop from that testing into the plans that we're writing to improve those plans so that they work better moving forward. I'll just say there that the FEMA has, or the Department of Homeland Security has the Homeland Security Exercise and Evaluation Program called HSEEP. And there's a ton of guidance out there on how to conduct an exercise. There's sample exercises and drills out there as well. That's something that our company has conducted with different federal agencies, and I think some state and local agencies as well. Ken Zaklakevich has a ton of experience, particularly in the HCP area. And so if you have any more questions about that, I encourage you to look up Homeland Security resources, or to reach out to Ken to learn more about this process as well, or how to incorporate it into some of your planning processes. Okay, some resources for preparedness include historical events. And this is a common theme across these different type of emergency management planning phases, is that folks will say, oh, it hasn't flooded here in 100 years, or, you know, I inherited this house from so-and-so and so-and-so, and a tornado has never impacted this area. Folks don't, you know, we have so many things to worry about in our day-to-day life, and many of us on the phone are quite fortunate. And so folks that are less fortunate then have even more stressful things to worry about, whether it's putting dinner on the table or paying bills and that type of thing. So also preparing for something that may or may not happen can be difficult for folks. And historic information is a good way in order to show people, hey, this did happen here. You know, water was as high as the bridge on Main Street, and we need to be able to react to that. And sometimes what we're not able to convince folks of in words, photos are able to convince folks of for us. So historic preservation departments or societies can be a resource for some of the work that we're doing to integrate into the plans that we're working on. Incident reports, breach reports from dams and levees, crime reports. Some of the information that's collected by HR departments and employee reporting can be helpful in identifying trips, slips, and falls and ways that we can prevent, you know, small issues from happening or small issues that can lead to bigger issues as well. These are some resources that are particularly focused on preparedness training, the Red Cross, the Salvation Army, and then also there's a program called Community Emergency Response Teams, and this is a great program for folks that want to volunteer in their community to help folks be even more prepared for disasters. And then I've got the SLO ARC, which is a Red Cross YouTube station, and they have videos on preparedness. And so they take something like a disaster supply kit and break it down into like a 5 or 10 minute video. And those can be good things to share with your colleagues, and, you know, have a preparedness minute in your offices to share information. Okay. As we dive into the next topic of prevention, I'll go ahead and dive into this. Prevention is really focused on risk reduction, looking at where there's vulnerability, looking at where there's security issues, and figuring out what a community is going to do about this. So in a day and age where we need to worry about both disasters that are, you know, natural occurring or accidents, we also have to worry about disasters that can be human-caused as well or of a malicious intent. And so if you're looking or partnering with working with, say, a facility that has hazardous materials, you know, looking at security cameras, looking at the placement of their fences, looking at how employees have access to their building, and what type of security checks are done on them before they start working at the liquid natural gas facility. That type of information can be part of prevention. And so what you're looking at is identifying what type of things could happen, what is the kind of worst case scenario, and then also what's the more likely scenario, which could be, you know, more of an accident type of situation. And usually preparing both for the more likely scenario and the worst case scenario, there'll be overlap there. So looking at security procedures, looking at fencing, looking at different type of cameras. These are things that can be put into a place, whether it be for, you know, one building, one set of procedures, or a larger area or neighborhood, are things that can prevent a disaster from happening in the first place. Okay. And before I dive right into emergency response and management, I'd like to say that preparedness and prevention planning go hand in hand. So when folks say from a transit agency again, take a look at this, they're looking at, you know, what type of things commonly happen, where do accidents happen, and how can we prevent them across the board, and putting plans in place in order to make that happen. So an example of this type of plan can be a security and emergency preparedness plan for a transit agency, or a facility security plan for a larger area like, you know, a natural gas facility. Now we're going to dive into emergency response and management. And the actions in these types of plans are really focused on protecting life first. And there's an emphasis there on human life and protecting folks from whatever type of disaster or response is happening. And then it comes in second, property and natural resources during a disaster event. There are a variety of different partners that are involved in emergency response planning, all the way from the local to the national level. And we're going to dive into that in a little bit more detail here. So the local partners are going to be your municipal emergency management, your county emergency management, your police, fire, EMS, hospital. These are the first folks that are on the scene that are responding to the event, whether it be a large fire, whether it be a flooding scenario, whether it be some sort of chemical release. They're responding and working to keep people safe. Then, at kind of the next level, or in cooperation with them, are the municipal and county council members or officials or leaders, whether they be mayors or town council presidents, et cetera. Public Works, they can have a specific role in putting out signage so folks don't continue to drive down the street that's up on the screen here as well. And then very shortly after, you know, the scene starts to get under control, being able to share information with the local media so that you're letting folks know to avoid a certain area or how they stay safe in this particular disaster. Another partner, and this changes by areas, can be the recipient of Homeland Security funding. In Pennsylvania, we have regional counterterrorism task forces that are conglomerates of several different counties working together. And they've worked to, you know, buy supplies, buy hazmat kits, buy decontamination materials so that they could get a whole, you know, hundreds of people through showers very quickly in a parking lot. The groups that have received this funding are often partners in responding to this type of disaster. And sometimes they're a conglomerate of the groups that I've said earlier, and sometimes they can include additional partners. And then there's a kind of a second wave, and they can be called second responders. And they're the folks that are both supporting the first responders and supporting the victims of a particular disaster. And they can be the CERT teams that I mentioned a couple slides back, the Red Cross. They can be voluntary organizations active in disaster. There's a variety of organizations out there that when a large event, disaster event happens, are able to respond. Some of them are faith organizations that open up their facilities as shelter or are equipped with vehicles to help feed folks during a disaster. And so we've got a whole group of organizations that help folks with comfort, hotel stays, and shelter as they get their feet on the ground after a disaster. Utility providers are partners in response. Sometimes after a disaster, the utility outage can end up being the larger disaster. We've had a lot of nor'easters on the East Coast here that have put out power for a week or more time. And, the snowstorm itself can be like a 12-hour event, but having your power out for a week in the winter can be a much larger crisis in certain situations. So utility providers and then animal sheltering organizations are important as well. That's something that was really a lesson learned from Hurricane Katrina when they talked to people about why they did not evacuate. And one of the reasons was concerns about their pets or wanting to stay with the pets and not being able to have their pets in shelters. And so I'd say really since that time, folks like the Red Cross and Salvation Army and other partners have been looking for ways to be able to take care of pets with their family because they realize that everyone's safety depends on caring for the pets as well. Okay. The type of plans that address emergency planning, the most typical one is emergency operations plans. And I'd say I haven't worked with a local county or state office that does not have an emergency operations plan. These can be pretty basic, but fall through the steps of who does what during a disaster. Some of the annexes to these plans will dive into locational specific things in more detail. So they may dive into the topic of evacuation or northeast Pennsylvania that is very rural. Sometimes it's hard to find a place where we can have public meetings up there. It's so rural. Is only a couple hours away from New York City. So they have an annex specifically focused on if there was a large event in New York City and they had tons of folks flooding into the rural area, how would they be able to respond to that? What are some of the plans that they can put in place to host a huge influx of folks during an evacuation? And then you can have plans, whether it be for a dam or a hazardous material site, that dive into what are the specific protocols in that area. We have a lot of Marcellus shale drilling in our area, and that's new. And if there's a release in this type of event, the local firefighters need to know what type of chemicals and materials are being used. Sometimes you want to use water to fight a fire. Sometimes you don't want to put water on certain types of fire. Having that type of information in the hands of first responders can be critical for the safety of them and the community as well. Local emergency planning committees. This is an acronym that's out there, LEPCs, and I think is particularly not well named because it really seems like it could be about anything. But these are specifically focused on hazardous materials and planning for hazardous materials in folks' communities. Vulnerable population plans are plans that can dive into, how are we going to make sure something like Katrina doesn't happen in our community? How do we get folks out of the city? How do we communicate to the different populations that are in our community? Should we have materials translated into different languages? Depending on when a disaster happens, will folks have access to money to put gas in their car to be able to get out of the city, to be able to evacuate? How do we let them know that we'll be able to evacuate them by bus and that they'd be safe trusting some of the systems that our city has in place in order to evacuate them? One of the key things in emergency response planning is communications. Disasters are stressful. It can be one of the most stressful events that happens to folks in their lifetime. And communicating to folks during this time can be hard. If we've reached out and taught them ahead of a disaster what information is available to them, they're more able to act on it during a disaster and be able to trust it. So if the first you're hearing during a disaster is that you get on the B route bus and that you're going to be taken to, you know, the mall right outside of your city, you may not trust that information as well as if you had heard about it before and digested it and talked about it with your family and know that, you know, you have an uncle near that mall that's going to be able to come pick you up and shelter you in his house for a couple of days. You can have organizational disaster response plans, and then a key here is also memorandums of understanding. And then these are very simple. Usually they're only a couple to a few pages long, and they say, hey, we're going to work together during a disaster. You know, we're going to work together to, you know, use the school district buses to help evacuate folks, or we're going to use gyms at the school district in order to shelter people. But these are the things we have to keep in mind when we're being hosted by a school district. The state partners in this type of planning are typically emergency management agencies. They have different names in different areas, but you'll typically, you know, see something like a PEMA for Pennsylvania Emergency Management Agency, or VDEM for Virginia Disaster Emergency Management. So there's different names in different areas. Transportation is really important during a disaster, so state departments of transportation can be partners in any type of response, the state police. Sometimes the disaster is a flu. H1N1 virus was a disaster that impacted our areas and luckily was more alarming in its kind of initial outbreak than it was long term. But departments of health were key players in figuring out how they were going to get people vaccinations and that type of thing. The National Guard can be a partner in helping to evacuate people or to secure a scene. And then many state agencies will have emergency liaison officers or other types of officers of different names that support state agencies during a disaster. You know, so if there's a disaster that was impacting the environment, there's probably a representative at your state's Department of Environmental Protection or Community and Natural Resources, et cetera, that would be able to go to your emergency management office and help support and provide information on, you know, if there's this type of release, this is the type of thing that is impacting, this is how long it would take to get downstream and impact this different community and that type of thing. There's regional and state partners as well, and plans that address all of these different things. One of the most comprehensive planning processes that happened in our country is related to the nuclear facilities. And so since the 3 Mile Island incident, also here in Pennsylvania, the nation's really had very specific planning, response planning, evacuation planning, and drills related to nuclear facilities all across our country. And since those are regulated and happen on a certain time frame of, you know, every year this type of activity happens, every 3 years there's a full drill, that type of thing, they can be a resource for this type of planning. State emergency operations plans, POD plans, which is point of dispensing, which is what you would do if you were having a health emergency. You would have POD areas where folks like us would be able to go get a vaccination for the particular disease that was impacting people at the time. POD plans can also be important and take into consideration some of that preparedness planning that we were talking about earlier. So you want to be able to, say, have bus drivers to be able to drive people to and from the pod facilities to be able to get their vaccinations. Something that you can do to have enough bus drivers to be able to respond to that event is to make sure that them and their families are vaccinated first so that they feel comfortable during this particular disease outbreak helping to take care of their community and that they're not worried about themselves getting sick or their families getting sick. FIRA is a kind of twist on the hazard identification and risk assessment that Mike talked about in his presentation that's required for hazard mitigation plans. It takes a look at threat in more detail, so it takes a bit more look at human-made hazards, and it also looks at the consequences of the disaster. And so your state agency, you know, in any of our states, maybe not as much out west, but flooding can be the largest disaster. But by being used to responding to floods, maybe that's not a disaster that, you know, keeps the emergency managers up late at night. And what they're really worried about is the consequences of a major disease outbreak, because it would tax their resources more and that it would have an incubation period and be harder to respond to. So the FIRA analysis looks at what is the consequence of this event on our ability to respond, in addition to some of the things about what the actual risk is in that particular area as identified in the hazard mitigation plan. Okay, now we're going to zoom up to the national level, and all of this planning is really captured in the Presidential Policy Directive 8 and the National Preparedness Goal. And the National Preparedness Goal really hits on these 4 areas that we've talked about wanting to be able to prevent, mitigate, respond to, and recover from the threats that impact our country. Some of the themes that you see in national guidance, whether it be for Homeland Security or for FEMA planning processes, is to look at the whole community. You know, don't look at just the emergency managers. You know, what can business partners do to help us respond to a disaster? How will the businesses that we need to recover from a disaster be impacted? You know, if we can't get you know, utility providers out to the scene to get utilities up and running, then everyone's going to have a hard time being able to recover from the disaster. Or having the Walmart open and folks being able to shop there and get their cleaning supplies and be able to help clean up their home is good for Walmart and is also good for our communities to be able to recover. So looking at all the partners that are potentials for helping to respond and recover and do all of these phases of emergency management planning. Implementation is a key focus, looking at both the testing in exercises and then how a plan was implemented during an actual disaster event, and then looking to improve the plan based on that information. And then, as we spent some time talking about in the mitigation section, this idea of integration. You know, that something that you do here can help with mitigation. Some of the capacity that you build in doing a mitigation plan can translate into recovery capacity after a disaster. The National Response Framework really lays out a lot of the information about how we would respond within our country, from the smallest to the largest catastrophe. The National Response Framework goes through these different areas that we've just talked about, from local to state to federal response. You know, the FEMA administrator just doesn't show up on day one of a disaster. The way that our system works in America is first local responders respond to the disaster. If they're overwhelmed, then they move it up to the county level or maybe a regional level and a few counties cooperating together to respond to an event. If they're overwhelmed, then they go to the governor. The governor may have a disaster declaration for the type of event that's going on. And then maybe the state is overwhelmed, and in that case, then they move up to FEMA. And then depending on the size of the disaster, the president can declare that this is a major disaster declaration to fund more funding into the area, both for response and recovery. So there's kind of a set procedure here, and from the local to the national level, everyone is invited in to respond. And then there is a plan in place that flexes to the different types of disasters that are out there. And so that plan is supported by emergency support functions. And these ESFs tackle a number of different areas. And you see some items in there that you'd expect, like transportation, mass care, which is sheltering, logistics, how we're going to get everything in place, energy, because we've just talked about how important utilities are, external affairs, and other items as well. And then on the next slide here, we have an example of how this falls into place for transportation. So transportation, assists in the management of how we're going to get people to or from the disaster that's happening to our area. How do we, what are the transportation needs of this particular disaster? And there's the lead, which you would expect would be our national DOT. They're the primary agency, but there's support agencies under there. And one of the examples I like to point out is the U.S. Postal Service. You wouldn't necessarily think of them, as emergency responders, but they're folks that are in our communities every day, and they have a lot of vehicles. Depending on the type of event, they can be very helpful in getting information out to folks. They can be helpful in transporting things as well. Maybe you have a mail carrier that's getting cots to one of the shelters instead of delivering mail for that day in a very large-scale disaster. Say there was a pill that we needed to take for a public health emergency. The post office can deliver that pill to the doorstep of everyone in America probably more quickly than any other partner on this list. So the idea here with having different types of agencies that support is we never know exactly what's going to happen in emergency management planning, and so we have to be flexible in planning for a variety of scenarios that we can imagine, and then a variety of scenarios that we can't imagine until they actually happen. And by having different partners plugged into it, we're able to flex to whatever the occasion is, hopefully. Okay. So what do we, as urban planners, do during an event or before an event to plan for emergency response? I've got repetition on the slide because I think it's important. We're really, really strong in organizing information. All of us, probably have a to-do list in front of us or written down somewhere nearby or on one of our, tools that we use on a regular basis. Emergency managers need this information. They need not only the 12 typical shelters that they would be funneling folks to, but they need the 27 backup shelters in case those top 12 are in the flood-prone area for some reason. They need GIS information. They need information mapped out so that they know, hey, I've got my supplies set so that there's some on either side of the floodplain. So if the event that we're responding to is flood related, I'm not trapped with all of my cots on one side of the river away from where my safe shelters are. Coordination is key. Identifying and bringing folks into the room before a disaster event to think through some of these scenarios, to discuss these scenarios, to discuss the limitations of their organization, to say, hey, you know, for a long time, the American Red Cross could not take pets in their shelter. That was a limitation. You know, how are we going to respond to that? Do we have a humane society that can step in and be a partner in that? In many areas of our country, we're in the midst of an opioid crisis. Typically, sheltering for a disaster, you don't want folks that are using drugs in the shelter. But they're a vulnerable population that needs to be taken care of. How are we going to be able to take care of and shelter folks with addiction issues during a disaster? Who are the right partners to do that? Is there a health center or a rehab center that when folks are having trouble in the high school gym that we can send folks to so that they get additional support that they need during this disaster? Thinking through these things before the disaster, you know, the Red Cross having the contact person for the rehab center that can help some of the victims that are in the shelter with them, it's helpful if they've met them and coordinated before the disaster rather than in the midst of a disaster event when so much is going on. And then the final key thing here is outreach. And this gets back to the idea that I mentioned a little while ago, that folks act on things that they've learned before more easily than learning for the first time during a stressful time period. So how do we get the information out there about evacuation routes, about safe places, about school pickup, about what that daycare plan is, so that you're not panicked when you see your daycare closed, but you know that they're most likely at the other daycare about a mile away. One of the other key considerations in emergency management planning is really looking at our most vulnerable populations, taking a look at what our specific area is and how folks are impacted by poverty, how that's going to impact their ability to be able to respond to a disaster or recover from a disaster. How many folks are going to have a hard time understanding instruction in English? How can we get the information to them that will keep them safe during a disaster so that they know what shelters they can go to? Can we have materials translated in advance? Can we have translators lined up to translate what the mayor's saying into American Sign Language or the most common languages that are in our city? Having information out there about how to evacuate with children, how to be safe during a disaster, et cetera. I think all of these resources we've touched on during the previous slides. The last one I want to mention is the Emergency Management Institute. EMI is both a physical location in Maryland and also an online resource. Anybody that is, spurred to write a disaster plan or for their family or to learn more about any of these topics can visit this site and, take a 1-hour training and get a certificate later this afternoon if you're not tired after our 2.5-hour training. There's a lot of resources at EMI, and you can develop different types of certifications to be able to respond to disasters, whether it be at a small scale or a large scale, et cetera. Another resource is out in Colorado. out near my fellow presenter, Mike, and that's the Natural Hazards Center out of the University of Colorado. They have my favorite conference and also a newsletter where they share a lot of information on disasters. They work on planning and research related to all phases of emergency management planning, and really fascinating to follow. You can learn a lot and really see some of our nation's best practices and even international best practices through the newsletter they distribute, and if you become more interested in this area, through the conference that they host as well. Okay. So one of the key things that we wanted to conclude this section with is that partnerships and coordination are the key things that help make emergency response planning move better, and then the ability to leverage resources. We, at least in my career, seem to be a country that's always had limited resources. Our Department of Environmental Protection doesn't have enough money. Our emergency managers don't have enough money. As we work on projects and develop projects and plans together, being able to leverage each other's resources in order to come up with better plans and better scenarios is really important in the work that we do here. Okay. So that concludes the section on both preparedness, prevention, and response planning. That was kind of a dense section. The next two sections are luckily a little bit lighter and shorter, but we wanted to take folks off mute. Once again, a reminder that if you're in a loud area or not talking, to put your phone on mute. But if Tracy will take everyone off mute, we'll see if there's any questions after that section.
Yeah. Like, is he asking opinions, or like, is he asking for like opinions, or like? Yeah.
Okay. Does anybody have any questions or comments on that section? Any great resources out there that you'd like to direct folks to, or a sample plan you worked on?
Sarah,
yeah.
The online
What's that? I didn't quite hear the question.
There's it's E-Plan, which is for cultural institutions, emergency preparedness planning. And so I just put on the chat a link to that to you. And I'm using a tried emergency preparedness plan right now for organization in Annapolis.
What did you hear? What, mine?
Thank you.
I tried to keep my mouth shut, and Dad's like, oh, come on, Diane, I know you have something else to say. I was like,
can you please make sure your phones are on mute? Thank you.
Okay, Tracy, I think you moved us back to mute too.
Yeah, I did. That was too loud.
That's okay. It's a long training, and I think all of us, part of our job is multitasking, so we totally understand. But yeah, for folks that didn't hear, Lisa Craig shared a resource and an example from Annapolis, and that link is in the chat section. It's www.dplan.org, and that I know that Annapolis has been doing a lot of interesting planning, partially because they have some, capacity to do so, but really a real urgency to do so based on their location. So check out that plan and follow up with Lisa if you have any questions. Okay, so if you need to, stand up and shake it off, and we'll dive into the last two sections of today. The next section is disaster recovery planning, and this is something that I think many of us on the call that work in this field are particularly passionate about and interested in. It's something we get to do a little less than hazard mitigation planning, but it's something that can have a really huge impact on a community. So, what is it? It's planning to assist the community, obviously, in recovering from a disaster, but it's a plan that has a broader focus. It really wants to zoom in and focus on how can we make this community better? How can we bounce forward or improve what's going on in a community after a disaster? Okay. So some of the components of recovery planning are planning in advance for continuity of operations procedures, working to talk to staff after a disaster about how they were impacted by it, being able to replace the damaged assets, looking for reimbursable options, whether it be from a state or a federal disaster declaration, and then reviewing what happened and seeing how the lessons learned should funnel into the planning processes that we have. Recovering from a disaster is a challenge. It can be the largest challenge that any community faces, but it's also an opportunity. It's an opportunity to be able to make the community safer, and also a lot of federal funds flow into communities after a disaster, and so it becomes an opportunity to rebuild in a safer way. There's three types of kind of plans that focus on recovery. The first one is a continuity of operations plan. A long-term recovery plan is the second one, and then the third one is an after-action plan. Continuity of operations tends to focus on one business or one entity, such as an emergency management office. Long-term community plans look at a whole community, and after-action plans look at an event and how folks should take the information and the response to that event and use it to improve a variety of plans, or and they can be more than just emergency plans. It could be something that goes into the capital improvement plan or the comprehensive plan for the community as to be a future investment. So a continuity of operations plan identifies the threats that it can impact an area, identifies what type of training and exercise and testing are needed for an area, maybe establishes a call list, and sets communications procedures. So if we looked at any of our offices, you know, if we weren't able to access the downtown Philadelphia office, how would we be able to finish our work? Would we be able to go to a neighboring office to finish our work? Would we be able to access the information that we have on our server? How would we be able to operate in a disaster scenario? For a consulting firm, that's important, but for other types of agencies, like an emergency management agency, it can be even more important during a disaster. So you'll find that a lot of clients, such as emergency management offices or U.S. Visit, or folks that have a more critical mission than a consulting firm, have these types of plans and practice these types of plans. You know, so Pennsylvania Emergency Management practice a live-scale drill and exercise to evacuate from their typical building to another building to see what they were able to access, what they were missing, how they were able to work in their backup facility during the disaster to make sure that that critical element of their work and access to their work didn't make a catastrophe in Pennsylvania even larger than it would be normally. Long-term recovery plans are more community-focused, and they really focus on the whole impact. So they're more than just the people, property, and natural environment and how they're impacted by a disaster, but how is the economy impacted by a disaster? How is our social cohesion impacted by a disaster? You know, if we have something like Katrina where only, you know, half of your neighbors come back to your block, what does that mean for your sense of community and neighborhood? What does that mean for the, you know, infrastructure investments in your community if half as many people are living there as lived there before? If you're a shore town or a beach town, you know, how is the economy impacted? You know, did the hurricane hit in July and, you know, not only knock out many of the housing and buildings in your area, but also make your community lose 2 months worth of revenue that keeps you floating through the whole year because you're such a tourist-based community? Is there time to, you know, get the hotels and the boardwalk and everything up and running before the next beach season starts in June of the following year? Looking at kind of the big picture items of how your community is impacted. Long-term recovery planning looks at that idea of whole community planning and identifying different programs and agencies to support implementation. Many long-term community or recovery plans focus on champions and, hey, okay, we've got all these great ideas. We can't do them all. Let's narrow it down to a list of 10 that we know are going to be implemented because we can put names in place of who's going to implement these 10 critical actions to help us recover from this disaster and then be safer from future ones. After action reports are really a chance for the key responders or the core agencies that help support your community to get together to review what happened and what can be improved for future plans. When we talked about counseling for a disaster a few slides back, one of the examples I think of is an after-action report that we worked on after Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey. The emergency managers were so overwhelmed by the disaster that they had all the secretaries that worked for the county and some of the municipalities come in to answer a phone bank. And the secretaries who on a day-to-day basis had some fairly, you know, straightforward customer service duties were really stressed by the phone calls that they had during the disaster. You know, they were receiving calls from folks that were trapped in their homes. They were receiving calls from folks that were afraid that their, you know, father had passed away during the storm and they had no way to access him and see if he was safe. They were responding to calls that were much more stressful than probably any of the calls that we'll handle in our careers. And so you can imagine how upsetting that would be to people. And so, you know, having follow-up so that they could have a group or a meeting with a counselor to talk about some of the things that they heard as they returned to their normal day-to-day jobs is an important thing. There we go. Some of the things that work across these type of recovery plans is co-mentoring, learning from folks that have been through it before, which is similar to networking, recognizing that one funding source is probably not going to make your community whole. So looking at the different options that are available to you and leveraging different funding sources, engaging a variety of people and stakeholders. Basically, the more ideas you have at the table, the more resources and opportunities you have to leverage things. An example of this idea is the patchwork quilt approach. This is an idea that was really kicked off by our former colleague, Ed Thomas, who also used to work at FEMA. And the idea was that a community needs to piece together a variety of different things in order to make it whole. So FEMA funding is one thing, but technical assistance from the Army Corps, a program from the Department of Agriculture, these three things together may be what helps the community the best and helps them recover. That you have to kind of learn from some of your peers and piece together different ideas to be able to become more resilient. Some recovery resources out there. There's the National Recovery Framework, and then there's significant funding. Some of the biggest funding streams are identified by FEMA, and the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery via HUD are two of the key funding sources. But if you're looking for more, the Natural Hazard Mitigation Association has the most current version of the patchwork quilt up on their website, and you can see dozens of different options that help with disaster recovery there. Okay. One of the other things we wanted to touch on is that outreach is important in all of these planning processes. Really building on existing Facebook and Twitter networks to get ideas and information out there has been valuable to all sorts of disaster responses across our country. Often going to people in order to get the information out there is the most important thing. So meeting folks at science centers or sustainability forums, providing opportunities for people to say what works and doesn't work online is important, and getting people involved in this and really seeing where they are and how to get them the information. Something else we wanted to highlight was Google websites. They are $15 a year approximately, and can be a way to get a lot of information out during a hazard mitigation plan update or a recovery plan process, and really pool different information out there. Okay, so that concludes the recovery section. Tracy, do you want to take us off mute one more time and see if folks have any questions? Okay, we're sounding a little better this time. Do any folks have any comments or good ideas about recovery? Okay. Brad, do you have the slides up to present, or do you want to build off of my slides?
So now we're going to discuss sort of resilience as a whole and its relationship to hazard mitigation. Next slide. So there seems to be hundreds of variations when defining resilience, but what's captured here are two of the most commonly used, and one I feel in a second has a key difference. So the first is from the National Security Strategy, and it's a really common simplified definition of the ability or capacity to adapt to changing conditions and prepare for, withstand, and rapidly recover from disruption. So that's probably the most common from a domestic perspective. From a global and international perspective, the IPCC definition is probably the most widely used, and the ability of a system and its component parts to anticipate, absorb, accommodate, and recover from the effects of a hazardous event, including through ensuring the preservation, restoration, or improvement of basic structures and functions. So it's a little bit long, but next slide. There is a slightly simpler version that I like that has one key difference, and that is from some research recently in 2017, the ability to anticipate, prepare for, respond, and adapt to events, both sudden shocks and gradual change, in order to survive and prosper. And as someone that works, in resilience and across the water group and at times in hazard mitigation, this is really important for something that is slow moving like sea level rise. So I like the definition of, yes, it can be essentially an immediate disturbance or a rapid disturbance, or it can be something that's long-term gradual change, such as long-term erosion, sea level rise, and things of that nature. So next slide, please. And so really, kind of what is the difference between resilience and hazard mitigation? Sometimes they're used interchangeably, and although very similar and overlap, they are in fact slightly different. So when we look at the definitions, hazard mitigation focuses on planning and effort, while resilience focuses on capacity. Next slide, please. And so resilience is measured and based upon capacity. Capacity lost due to the event, capacity to immediately handle and subsequently recover, and then the capacity to improve. This first graphic is very common, and you can see the loss in capacity due to a disaster or a disturbance event followed by a response and recovery period. The line often goes back to the same level as before the event. Tracy, can you go ahead and click? What we're trying to do here is not recover to a previous stage, but promote mitigation, adaptation, and smart redevelopment to establish a more resilient community, not returning to a previous level of resilience, but moving forward and enhancing that resilience. Can you click one more time, Tracy? So as you can see with the red curve I've added, reducing capacity loss ultimately leads to a more efficient and effective response and recovery. So enhancing capacity to recover is a major piece to resilience. Next slide, please. Resilient communities aim to improve current development challenges and really buffer against shocks and stresses. A recent report from the United Kingdom Scientific Commission stated that resilience is the capacity to absorb, utilize, or even benefit from perturbation, shocks, and stresses, which includes the idea that resilient systems, provided they're sufficiently robust, can actually benefit from perturbations. And if you have an ecological background, I'm sort of an ecologist by education, it sounds very similar to something called the intermediate disturbance hypothesis, which is the idea that intermediate disturbances actually enhance diversity in an ecosystem, which essentially creates a more resilient and healthier ecosystem. And it's kind of interesting and almost against the general logic that a disaster or a disturbance could actually improve a community's resilience. But what this new research is saying is because a disaster can actually, and often does, become a catalyst for communities to place themselves on a more resilient trajectory and start implementing projects that actually create a more resilient community. Next slide, please. So although slightly different, mitigation planning and actions increase resilience. The National Institute of Building Science looked at the results of 23 years of federally funded mitigation grants provided by FEMA, the U.S. Economic Development Administration, and HUD, and found mitigation can save the nation $6 in future disaster costs for every $1 spent on hazard mitigation. Most of us are pretty familiar with that. Even more so, every $1 a business spends on hurricane protection reduces loss exposure by an average of $105, according to new analysis by FM Global. So what FM Global did is they're a Rhode Island-based insurer, and they looked at over 10,000 wind and flood-related investments and their associated reduction in property loss and business disruption exposure for 1,800 global clients from 2008 to 2017. And according to a statement a couple weeks ago, these estimates are calculated based on actual losses that have occurred at tens of thousands of properties insured by that company. So when looking at specifically some of the federal grant programs, it's it is now not 1 to 4, it is 1 to 6. And if you consider some of the private investment, you're looking at $1 spent and a return of $105. So recovery efforts post-disaster should consider building back better to improve and enhance resilience for the next event. Demonstrating that community investments in resilience will yield measurable short and long-term benefits that balance or exceed the cost is really critical for sustained commitment to enhancing resilience. A lot of times there is a difficulty to that sort of upfront cost, and trying to communicate long-term benefit to communities and overcome that initial sort of sticker shock is really difficult, but it is imperative to long-term resilience. Next slide, please. So one of the big things that we see in resilience is addressing future conditions, and this really ranges from things like sea level rise, extreme weather or climate variability, erosion, saltwater intrusion, and this also includes development or future development in the floodplain. So what changes does development have on things such as flood pathways? And I liked one of the definitions earlier because, like I said, climate and future conditions are not necessarily these abrupt changes, and it's addressing these gradual changes in order to survive and prosper is really important. So there really is one thing that you don't have in traditional disaster response or general hazard mitigation is that sometimes with future conditions, there actually is time to mitigate and time to adapt. Next slide. And so one of the things that's really important to that premise is adaptive capacity. As we said, resilience is based upon capacity. And adaptive capacities are the social and technical skills and strategies of individuals and groups that are directed towards responding to environmental, socioeconomic, and other changes. So adaptive capacity is narrowly focused on the specific skills and mechanisms that are deployed by human systems to contribute to resilience. And future conditions don't impact all communities or individuals equally, which Sarah mentioned earlier. Those in communities with significant vulnerable or underserved populations, or even those in developing countries, have significantly less adaptive capacity to address future conditions or disasters than more prepared communities, for instance, in first world countries like the United States. And even across the United States, there is a dramatic variation in adaptive capacity. I'm in the Mid-Atlantic. An excellent example of this would be communities on the eastern shore of Maryland, which are extremely vulnerable to sea level rise. They're very rural, faith-based, and generally have a lower income than the national average, versus something like a place like the city of Baltimore, where Baltimore has the knowledge, support, financial wherewithal, tax base to address sea level rise in a myriad of ways, while those on the eastern shore really have a lot more limited options or funds to adapt. The next slide, please. And so this slide might be a little bit confusing at first. We are not talking about IT right now, but sort of we'll get into why this is kind of relevant. Hazard mitigation planning is the foundation of community resilience because it encourages the development of a long-term mitigation strategy. By going through the planning process, communities think about their risks, develop mitigation actions, and projects before a disaster even has a chance of occurring, making it easier to recover from future events. So this graphic on network resilience for computer systems is an excellent way to represent how resilience is built as an interconnected framework. So in the top graphic, there's a direct pathway. However, if one system fails, everything fails. In the middle graphic, there's an increase in service redundancy, but because this is not integrated into the full pathway, there is still a linear process which will cause system failure. So what we look at is in the final graphic, the system becomes resilient and is the most reliable because there are multiple support pathways and appropriate levels of redundancy. It's no different in a community setting because establishing an interconnected support structure and appropriate levels of redundancy in a community allow for improved continuity of operations, emergency response, and then ultimately improves resilience. So hazard mitigation and land use planning are just some of the specific ways to identify these pathways, recommend actions in an effort to reduce the impacts of a disaster. Next slide, please. So what are some of the types of resiliency plans? There are a variety of plans that directly address resilience, and then others that resilience is sort of integrated or incorporated throughout. So there are things that are very simply resiliency plans. There are climate adaptation plans and climate adaptation or action plans that put resilience very much at the forefront. It is the focal point. Then there are other plans where resilience is sort of integrated throughout, housing and infrastructure resiliency or vulnerability assessments. A lot of communities now are putting them in comprehensive master plans. And ultimately, resilience should be integrated in all of your plans. That is how you create this interconnected network that's going to enhance your community capacity. Next slide, please. So one of the biggest things with resilience right now is advocacy. So advocating for strong, resilient communities. And a number of organizations exist who are actively advocating for advancing resilience nationally, at a state level, locally, and even by profession. So the American Planning Association has a very significant resilience presence. The American Institute of Architects, Association of State Floodplain Managers, National Association of Counties is a really big proponent of resilience and really does a great job of working on the local level and fostering policy at the national level that is going to make a difference locally. And then we also have probably the largest and most recognizable is 100 Resilient Cities. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a great summary slide. I really like this graphic. It defines resilience as the ability to withstand and recover, as well as learn from past disasters to strengthen future response and recovery. But I like that it outlines these three things that a resilient community can do. So it can determine what it needs to reduce damage and use its assets or resources wisely. It's resourceful, no matter what the condition or what the amount of resources. So resilience is not based upon money, it is based upon capacity, and just because you don't have the resources of New York City or Miami does not mean that there are not small steps your community can take to become more resilient. Not only do they bounce back quickly, but they take the opportunity to strengthen the health, environmental, and social and economic systems. So they look at recovery and redevelopment as an opportunity to become better, and they learn from the past to be better at response. Next slide, please. So really quickly, we're just going to talk about a couple projects, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on this, that Baker has done, and we really have a diverse hazard mitigation and resilience portfolio. And here on the screen, you'll see the PennDOT Extreme Weather and Vulnerability Study. So Sarah was a critical individual leading that effort. We have the climate change impacts and assessments for New York City airports. We have things like the Maryland Department of Transportation climate change support. Karen Oman did this Delaware Bayshore mitigation alternatives and addressing sea level rise and inundation there. Next slide, please. We have the City of Central Colorado Disaster Resiliency and Recovery Master Plan. Colorado also did something really great. They did it's for Larimer County. They did an unmet needs and community fragility study, which I think is a really innovative approach to get at some of the gaps in community needs and how to address those. There's the West Coast Climate Action and General Plans. I think most of us know that particularly, California and the Pacific Northwest take future climate very seriously, so we're seeing that as a very prevalent piece of their planning. Next slide. And as Sarah mentioned, resilience is a huge component of our FEMA community engagement and risk communication contract. And most of the offices nationally touch this contract, and in fact, FEMA recently just restructured and created the FEMA Resilience Organization branch to address the importance of resilience to their efforts. So that's it. I know that was sort of rapid fire. We have about 5 minutes left, but we can hop to the next slide. And if there's any questions for myself or Mike or Sarah, we will gladly take the next 5 to 10 minutes to answer those.
Great. This is Sarah. Can folks hear me now?
Yes.
Oh, yay. I was just going to add on to what Brad said, that the PennDOT Extreme Weather project was led by Dan Sagaris out of our Harrisburg office, and that's a great example of a project where an existing client wanted to look at climate change in more detail, and went to trusted air quality issues previously with them, and then some of the resiliency staff to work with them. I see one question, which was, will the resources or slides be available after the training? And yes. Tracy, would they be posted to the practice website or emailed out? What works for that?
So the training is being recorded, and I believe that Learning and Development will actually put it in the Michael Baker University so that it can be watched. But I also will convert the recording and upload it to YouTube and post it on the planning community site. And we can even send out the slides and the YouTube link to the planning and water groups if that's what we want to do.
Great. Yeah, whatever works for folks.
Would you like me to unmute everybody again? I
don't know.
let them back off.
I guess, does anybody have any other questions or comments? Maybe put them in the chat box. Okay. Well, it sounds like we're pretty good on questions. And so I'd like to thank everyone for participating. Thank my co-presenters for doing such a fabulous job and diving into this. I hope that everyone found it interesting. And if it gave you ideas for collaboration moving forward, please reach out to any of us. This is something that we're all passionate about and would love to help give you more information to do more of. So thanks a lot, everyone.